So good afternoon again, everyone, and welcome. So Africa, Europe, Europe-Africa, the EU-Africa partnership. Whichever way you call it, whatever you call it, this relationship, this partnership is a long-standing one and a very valuable one, and one that really responds especially to today's challenges. But while we all agree on the importance of this relationship, I think you'll agree that we also need it to be revitalized, re-energized, and modernized to take into account the challenges we face in today's turbulent and pretty challenging world. Having said that, it's clear that all of us here are working in different ways to revitalize this relationship. The European Union is doing it, the European Commission, the External Action Service, and we're here today because the Center for Global Development has brought out a report which is also about how you re-energize and reorient and actually define this relationship in the coming years. And this is an important moment to do that because, of course, we have a new EU leadership and we're hoping that, this will take it in a new, more positive direction. We at Friends of Europe, I'm Shada Islam from Friends of Europe, we're also working on this with the One campaign and also with the Mo Ibrahim Foundation and the European Commission. So in a sense, it's great minds think alike, and that's why I'm really delighted to be here today. So some rules of the game. Michaela Gavas from the Center for Global Development will present a PowerPoint in which she will define and underline some of the salient points of this new report. After that, we have a very, very interesting and quite an amazing panel of experts and policymakers who will join me here on the platform, on the stage. We have Stefano Banservisi, Director General for DG DEFCO, and Stefano, of course, is one of the most eminent, I have to say, active policymakers on development, and I've always cherished our partnership, Stefano, and will miss you very much when you retire. But thank you very much for being here. Also with us, Her Excellency Sena Xiao Boateng, Ambassador of Ghana to the European Union. You will join us here on stage as well later on. Michaela, of course, will stay with us and take questions. We have Mr. Ambroise Fayol, Vice President of the European Investment Bank, and last but not least, my dear friend Koen Verwake, Managing Director for Africa at the External Action Service. So without further ado, Michaela, this is your show. Could I ask you to come here, please, and present the salient features of your roadmap for changing this relationship, please.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Shada. Thank you all for being here. It's a great privilege for me to stand here and present the Center for Global Development's roadmap for the new European leadership. This is a joint effort by a number of researchers from CGD, some of whom are actually in the room today, so please feel free to corner them when you have a chance. So, what I'm going to do is very briefly tell you who we are, because I'm sure some of you do not know us. I'm going to go on to talk about our motivation for the roadmap, and then I'm going to set out our proposals. These are proposals for how we think the new EU leadership can move from an aspiration of an EU-Africa partnership to reality. So we are a non-partisan independent think tank. We're based in Washington, D.C., in London, and in Brussels. And we mainly focus on the intersection of developing countries and the governments and institutions that can help them deliver the greatest progress. So we conduct rigorous, impartial economic research, and what we try to do is design very practical policy solutions as well as spur intellectual debate and critical global development conversations. Some of the key work that we've done are on the slide, including incubating the landmark legislation. This is the BUILD Act, to strengthen U.S. development finance and the new U.S. Development Finance Institution. We've designed the advanced market commitment for vaccines. We've created the cash on delivery aid model, as well as development impact bonds. And we're the architects of the Commitment to Development Index, This is an index that ranks countries according to how beneficial their policies are towards developing countries. And finally, we also convene an annual conference of development leaders for critical learning based on practical experience. So, why a roadmap? Well, we think the arrival of a new leadership team in Brussels actually provides a major opportunity for Europe to rebuild, rethink a partnership with its continental neighbor, Africa. Why? And why is this so important? Well, firstly, because the scale of the development challenge in Africa is huge. By 2030, around 1/4 of Africa's population is expected to be living in poverty. The continent will contribute more people to the workforce each year than the rest of the world combined. So to avoid mass unemployment, African economies will need to create more than 18 million jobs per year. And yet, trade, investment, and productivity lag far behind other regions. Add to this the threats posed by climate change, large-scale epidemics, and rising debt, and it's clear that Africa needs development partnerships now more than ever. Secondly, the region's underdevelopment has serious consequences for the EU. We are already seeing these. So Africa's vulnerability has contributed to the influx of refugees and migrants. This has rocked the EU's internal cohesion. It's empowered populist forces, threatened the survival of the Union. But it has also come at a high opportunity cost for European investors, consumers, and employers. A prosperous Africa would provide new opportunities for investment, cheaper and more varied imports, and a ready supply of skilled new workers at a time when Europe's working age population is in serious decline. And thirdly, the EU is well placed to offer Africa a mutually beneficial partnership. We believe the EU has the ambition, the tools, and the opportunity to build a true development partnership with Africa. It is already Africa's largest trading partner, investor, and development assistance provider. The EU-Africa Alliance, announced last year, was an important first step. So our roadmap attempts to outline how this vision can become a reality. In our report, we examine specific policy areas. We look at 4 areas: migration, development finance, trade, and global health. And what we try to do is present actionable proposals that the EU's new leadership can take forward. Now, we do not contend that these are the only areas where the EU can make a difference, but they are areas where significant and meaningful progress can be made that benefits both Africa and Europe. So if Europe is to continue to grow and sustain its current social programs, it will need a substantial increase in the number and type of workers. At the same time, the working age population in sub-Saharan Africa is booming. While most of these new labor market entrants will join increasingly developed local economies or migrate regionally, others will seek work in Europe. So in May 2015, the European Commission presented a comprehensive European migration agenda on migration, designed to respond to the 2015 refugee crisis through 4 pillars. So under these 4 pillars, much has been achieved. Increasing refugee resettlement numbers, supporting member states with border management, financing integration projects, combating smuggling networks, fighting trafficking, and working broadly on development and security efforts in countries of origin. And these efforts have resulted in successes, including reducing the level of irregular arrivals. But future success is not guaranteed. To reduce the incentives for irregular migration, attract the right set of talent and skills to Europe, and enable admissions to be tailored to labor market needs, Europe needs new kinds of legal pathways for migrants. So while the Commission cannot propose a common migration policy, it does actually have an important role to play in promoting, facilitating, and supporting the creation of new kinds of legal labor migration pathways across Europe. So a global skills partnership is such a pathway. It is a bilateral agreement between equal partners. The country of destination agrees to provide technology and finance to train potential migrants with targeted skills in the country of origin prior to migration, and then receives migrants with precisely the skills they need to integrate and contribute best upon arrival. The country of origin agrees to provide that training and gets support for the training of non-migrants too, increasing rather than draining human capital. So we think the Commission should, first of all, pilot and scale global skill partnership projects between Europe and sub-Saharan Africa. The Commission is already supporting similar projects through its Mobility Partnerships facility and should continue to do so by expanding and diversifying the financing and support available, and by providing and promoting the opportunity among member states based on the current and emerging needs and priorities. And secondly, we believe the Commission should pilot global skill partnership projects within Africa. The Commission can finance partnerships between a country of origin, say Niger, and a country of destination, say Tunisia. And this would create a complementary workforce that helps alleviate pressures for both countries. So investment in projects in sub-Saharan Africa have great potential to achieve high development impact. However, these projects are chronically underfinanced by European development finance institutions and private investors because of real or perceived low-risk adjusted returns. So as you can see from the graph, too little private finance actually gets invested in some of the low-income countries. And this is where the need is greatest. The problem is not a lack of money or tools. It is that the development finance institutions are not incentivized to make riskier investments in underserved markets due to operational, institutional, and behavioral impediments. Then in 2017, the Commission launched an ambitious program of investment mobilization in Africa and its neighborhood, the European External Investment Plan. This plan actually has a vital role to play in pushing the development finance institutions beyond business as usual and incentivizing them to mobilize investment for higher risk markets. But is it actually doing this? Well, the evidence to date suggests it is not. And the main problem is that the External Investment Plan is troubled by a lack of a clear policy steer on its multiple objectives. So is it intended to operate as a high leverage fund, mobilizing the maximum quantity of investment for a given input of EU budgetary resources? Or is it supposed to be a high risk fund, mobilizing investment for underserved markets with low risk adjusted returns? At the moment, it is unclear which one of the two it is. Furthermore, the criteria for actually selecting investment proposals for EU support are relatively vague. So what this means is that the development finance institutions have maximum flexibility to propose investment programs that suit their objectives, their specialization, and their risk appetite. So without any political steer or competitive incentive, the development finance institutions are unlikely to undertake more complex or risky investment programs that are having trouble getting off the ground. Rather, they may simply use the Commission's risk-sharing tools to increase the expected return of investment that is slightly suboptimal or worse, already commercially viable. So the problem is that the Commission, through its instruments, is not pushing the development finance institutions much beyond their day-to-day operations, and in some cases may even be merely subsidizing the institution's business as usual. So the external investment plan and its risk mitigation tools could mobilize investment where the need is greatest. And in order to do this, the Commission needs to, number one, clarify the strategic objectives of external investment and steer it towards leveraging high-risk capital for underserved markets. Secondly, explicitly focus assistance on the poorest countries through very clear project selection criteria. And then thirdly, and importantly, federate the development finance institutions and focus on steering policy, encouraging best practice, and harmonizing procedures and results. So Europe has a vital role to play in stimulating export-led growth in Africa. Not only is it the region's largest trading partner by far, accounting for more than 1/3 of African countries' exports, it is also a key champion of Africa's regional integration efforts, specifically the new African Continental Free Trade Area, which was ratified in May 2018. So the EU and its member states are both a vital financier of the African Free Trade Area and an important proof of concept that economic union is attainable, sustainable, and mutually beneficial. The EU's trade policies for developing countries compare favorably to other advanced economies in certain key aspects. It is amongst the most open trade regime in the world for poor exporters. In fact, 52 out of 54 African nations pay low or no tariffs on their exports to Europe. And it provides substantial amounts of aid to stimulate trade, of which 60% is directed to Africa. However, there are certain long-standing non-tariff barriers to developing country trade that stain the EU's record. In our roadmap, we recommend that the Commission, number one, reform EU rules of origin, which determine where imports originate from, and therefore which tariffs are levied on them. These currently make it difficult for African countries to export products that include materials from elsewhere, and so hinder regional value chain creation. Secondly, reduce agricultural subsidies, which unfairly increase EU agricultural supply and lower prices on world markets at the cost of other nations. And then thirdly, ensure aid for trade is maximally effective by actually tying payment to results. Finally, on global health security. So in 2014, the Ebola outbreak in West Africa sickened more than 28,000 people and left over 11,000 people dead. As the outbreak spread through Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone, disrupting markets, healthcare, and routine government services, the international community struggled to mount an effective response. 5 years later, global preparedness remains low, as shown by the most recent Ebola crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda. However, pandemic response is not just an issue for developing countries. In times of increased globalization, interconnectivity, and global supply chains, health security is truly a global issue, and Europe has a responsibility to protect its citizens. This means preparedness at home and abroad. It's estimated that $4.6 billion a year is required to finance preparedness. And that's significantly less compared to the predicted economic loss of $60 billion per year if a pandemic occurs. But countries are just not adequately prepared to handle these complex, large-scale outbreaks, and existing funding mechanisms focus on response rather than preparedness. So total European Commission spend on global health in 2018 was around $38.9 billion. Of this, $2.9 billion went for Ebola, 272,000 for Zika, and approximately 71,000 for antimicrobial resistance. But as of July 2019, the EU has committed around 50 million to the Ebola response in the DRC, with around 4 million to increasing prevention and preparedness in neighboring countries. So the EU has shown promise. But commitment by individual member states is inconsistent, and efforts across the European Commission's Directorates General is fragmented. So while, for example, the Commission is a member of the Global Health Security Initiative, only 10 EU member states are members of it. So although the Commission's role is mostly limited to coordinating among member states, within the Commission itself, health security priorities and responsibilities are managed in a very segmented manner between the DGs. And these include DevCo, ECHO, Sante, Research and Innovation, as well as the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control. So we think the new Commission should do three things. First of all, it needs to strengthen collaboration and coordination across the DGs and entities holding global health security responsibilities and build links between interrelated capacities. Secondly, it needs to prioritize global health security and preparedness in the Commission's dialogue with member states. And thirdly, the Commission could develop a finance mechanism to increase sustainability, collaboration, and effectiveness on preparedness. A sort of a challenge fund could be established, which would help incentivize countries to invest their own resources and focus on progress towards mutually agreed outcomes. So Europe's new leadership has a unique opportunity to transform its approach to Africa into a sustainable two-way relationship based on a partnership of equals that is in both Africa's and in the EU's interests. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michaela. Thank you for a very, very thorough presentation. May I ask you to take your seat? Could I ask all the panelists also to please come on stage? And maybe if the lights could be turned off. This one, I mean, the PowerPoint, otherwise it's in my eyes. Great, please join me. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Michaela, thank you very much. And what I really do appreciate of your roadmap is that you've actually zeroed in on 4 key themes. A lot of us tend to go in all directions because when we look at this wonderful partnership, as you've said, we tend to take a very broad view and deal with too many things at the same time. It becomes a laundry list, right? That's because we're eager for change. But I like the fact personally that you've really focused on migration, which is, of course, a challenge that has jumped up the EU agenda, trade, development financing, and health. And let me just explain to you how I'm going to run this. I'm going to turn to our panelists here to give their reaction to what they've heard, to the roadmap, to specific ideas, if possible, because we're looking for specific reactions as well, but also your own hopes for the future. But I do recognize, I see so many of you here who know so much about this issue as well, that I'm going to then turn to you and give you the opportunity to engage with Michaela Michele, but also with our panelists. So, Stefano, I'm going to kick off with you. Your reaction, but also you've been one of the most fierce advocates of the Sustainable Development Goals being implemented, turned into a reality, not just in Africa and developing countries, but also within the European Union. And I was just wondering, from your point of view, your vantage point, Michele, and the roadmap, how does that fit in with your own agenda and your very, very clear ideas about how to take this relationship forward? Please.
Thank you very much. Good evening, and thank you to Michaela for the presentation and for the Center for this important contribution. I think it's the right moment to do it, because now we will have a new college in the next days, I think, and therefore it is important to feed critically, with reflection and with suggestion for action. So it's very welcome in time. Point number two. I'd say that there is several points on which I would like maybe to add something. I think it is certainly important to underline the unique, maybe, and certainly extremely strategic relation between the EU and Africa. I would like to underline the fact that in the global world, which is in the making, or in any case in transformation, we have at the same time, as European, to get out from certain form of Eurocentrism, which believes that there is only or mainly a special relation between EU and Africa, missing in this way, a very important point, that Africa is aware of its centrality in the world, for a number of reasons that we can discuss. So the first nuance, if you may say, I would put in this, yes, we have to further analyze, develop, and put in motion a partnership. Then I enter a bit into maybe some of the orientation, but as Europeans, and it's something that I keep saying since a while, for the SDGs and for the analysis that we have of the world, we have to look at that for Africa a bit like Africans are looking at themselves. And Africans are looking at themselves as a new protagonist or co-protagonist of many changes. Therefore, this is the first point, because if we don't put what we are doing into a fragmented geopolitical reality, we risk making mistakes, and missing part of the challenge that we have every day, This is point number two, let's say, in the sense of introducing these small, let's say, nuances in the analysis. Point number three, I think that we have to be aware that this is even more possible precisely because we are working under the SDG, let's say, umbrella. SDGs are very different from the MDGs in the past because they underline precisely the global challenge, and therefore they are sort of measurement of unsustainability of globalization. Hence, the necessity to do more as Europe as one. So it is an agenda for Europe integration, if I may say that in this way, because it is binding political on ourselves inside and is pushing us to be coherent and united in the global arena if we want to have a chance to contribute. And also because it is putting the accent not only or mainly in money distribution, but in policy setting. And I think that this must be very clear, since the beginning, because otherwise we'll get it wrong. And I have to say, since I guess we are speaking freely, in the sense of expressing not just the formal position, I think that within the Union and within the Commission, there is still extra miles to do. Because this, let's say, a specificity of the SDGs as a driver for many policy let's say, choices, including the coherence, are far from having been fully taken. And personally, and with me many others, were fully, let's say, happy to see the president elected mentioning SDGs for the internal policy, European semester. For those working on this, it's a huge change. Huge change. And therefore, suddenly linking, obviously, what we have to do, our reform agenda, our sustainability agenda, with our external action. It's not just talking about our values, solidarity, etc., but accepting to measure that and to link with it. So this is hugely important. And for me, and for many of us, by the way, it's a relief. Because, to tell the truth, this has not been perceived for long years. including in some government of our member state, but certainly in the Union. Allow me to be very, very frank, because otherwise we will hide a bit of things. Now, third point is about some of the inputs. Now, this is not only for me to comment, but simply to say that migration is, in my view, put the accent on the legal path is necessary. This is the part in which, being global, being the trust fund, being other things, we have been very modest for obvious political reasons. Obvious, But we have also to underline a couple of things in order to go along the path that you have designed. Is the question of, the doing together and the cooperation, which is not always supported by EU rules. In other terms, for labor market, numbers of workers which can have access, there is no Commission competence, no Union competence. And therefore it is important, if I may suggest, to introduce a strong alliance with the economic actors. Because at the end of the day, we will have a single market which is integrated economically with big conglomerates, European multinationals. So in any case, economic sectors which are integrated by filière. These economic sectors are in need, first and foremost, of workers. Presumably, not only, but presumably also from outside. Hence, since we cannot enact a directive which is saying this, that, and that, I think that we have to build progressively this migration policy on the labor market side with the economic actor of Europe. So if we have a single market of economy and a single market of labor in terms of European worker, well, in a sense, we have also to establish some common rules, the system according to which, according to rules, each member state is responsible for the quotas, for the numbers, at the end of the day will clash inevitably with what is the single space, and migrants, even under schemes like the one you just, are interested in our single market, not just the market of one country. Therefore, we have to work on that. And the second, the integration policy, equally, because integration policy also are national, by definition, because we cannot harmonize integration, even if the points you highlighted are the crucial one. Language, civic education, etc., etc. But also here, we have to work very much with the civil society in order to identify what are the drivers for then choices which are made much more local. I think in migration terms, this is probably the most important, and let's say a better organization between, let's say, what we are doing and the Minister of Interior in delivering visas is crucial, because, there is nothing worse than to open a path which then is stopped because a visa is not delivered. This is a powerful disaster. Then I will stop maybe here because there are many other things, but I will have things to say also on trade in air, but maybe in the framework of our discussion. Thank you.
So, Stefano, Michela, so I think we've taken on board that I think what the point Stefano is making is about involving the economic actors and civil society, and I think that is a very important input into your work. So thank you very much indeed for that. And of course the focus on SDGs, I think you've made it very clear in the roadmap as well that that is where you're headed. So thank you very much indeed. Ambassador, I wanted to get your reaction. Stefano also made one point, which I thought is reading it, I also had that reaction. It is very Eurocentric, isn't it? Did you feel that way? And if you did, what would you suggest as kind of countering it or balancing it?
Thank you, Sada, and thank you for how you're moderating this session. And Michaela, thank you very much for highlighting these issues. For me, and following up from what Stefano said, it has become clear that we in Africa, we've realized that our relationship with Europe, it's not going to be business as usual. This is a good and positive feeling. And that means that we both will sit around the table or are sitting around the table to discuss how our future relationship should be fashioned out and what framework to put in place to make sure that it is a win-win situation. It's mutually beneficial in the areas that Michaela has highlighted. Let's take our continental free trade area coming up. This is we're supposed to kickstart in July 2020. But before we get there, have we addressed issues between ourselves? if we take Africa, we trading amongst ourselves, Africa, is just 16% of our combined GDP, okay, compared to Europe, which is about 75%. How is Europe doing this? Have we sat down to look at how to encourage ourselves to trade amongst ourselves? What are the modalities? The CFTA, we know it's going, apart from the WTO, is going to be the largest trading area. How is that going to be beneficial to both sides? How are we going to maximize the rules of origin, which Michaela has talked about, and also IP, intellectual property, competition? All these are areas that we must be talking about right now, so that come July 2020, we will all be in a position to enjoy the fruits of the CFTA. I think I'll stop here for now.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I was just wondering, in terms of Africa being part of global value chains, I think that's a point that Michaela made as well, that the economic transformation that we are hoping for will require more integration into global value chains. So do you see the CFTA and Michaela's point about giving that emphasis and priority?
Certainly. What will play in terms of this issue will be the skills building. We need to have the requisite skills to be able to enjoy this integration. Otherwise, we will not be able to get the benefits that the youth, the teeming youth of Africa is going to present. What I didn't hear from Michaela is how artificial intelligence is going to affect the integration processes and the building of skills for the youth and prepare us for this integration process.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So we'll come back to some of these issues. So turning you to the European Investment Bank now, there was a very specific point that Michaela made, the roadmap makes, about what she calls lack of clear policy steer for the external investment plan when it comes to Africa, and the need to mobilize financing for the high-risk countries. And I was wondering your response to that, Mr. Fayol.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. Maybe just one word about EIB. The European Investment Bank is the bank of the European Union. And most of our activity is within the European Union, but we have more or less 10% outside of the EU every year, in close cooperation with the European Commission and the EAS. And a very good part of that is in Africa. Last year we have done 3.3 billion euros of projects financing in Africa. 3.3 billion euros. I would say that in good part what Michaela says is right, and in good part it is also, you always have a lag that you feel about institutions with the glasses of what was the situation 5 or 10 years ago. Because the situation that you have presented is true, that the financing is not necessarily going primarily to low-income countries. At the same time, it is true that things have changed. We have, for example, in the implementation of the Cotonou Agreement, the ACP relationship, which is mostly in Africa, we have introduced a window for financing within the investment facility those projects with higher risk and higher development impact in the private sector. And that is quite successful, and I think member states are very happy with the way we are dealing with that. I would also say that where we can help is to crowding in private sector resources, and mobilize private sector resources, because it is clear that the needs are so huge that we need to find ways to either create efficient markets. For example, we have with a big asset manager in Europe launched an initiative, because green bonds are issued in the north and climate challenges are global. So how do you manage to have funding of green bonds to be issued by financial institutions in developing countries, often in local currency? And that we have committed that we would buy these bonds so that we can try to develop the market, and that is also something that is quite important. I will finish there. I think one of the things that we have tried to develop in the recent years as an institution that is putting, the policy priorities first, that is developing the links with European institutions. One of the things that we have tried to do is to convey the message, a positive message in Europe about what is going on in Africa. And there are plenty of things that are not known enough. The private equity market is developing quickly in Africa. And it's a very interesting one that we finance through equity financing. We have developed what we call sustainable awareness bonds, which is, you create links to what Stefano mentioned about SDGs. We've selected one sector, for example, water projects, and we issue bonds that are going to finance only these kind of projects, linked to the question about result management and how we can measure impact, which is going to be key. Final comment. I personally was surprised that climate was not one of the items that were looked at, because I think it is absolutely a priority for our bank, but it is a priority in general, and it is a priority for Africa certainly. And conversely, I think the priority put on health issues is very well taken, and we need to do more in the health sector. We need also, maybe we can discuss that later, but when you talk about financing in Africa, of course, you need to take into account the fact that there are more and more concerns about debt levels. And that has an impact, especially for a number of low-income countries. This has an impact about the ability to increase financing, but not to increase the prospect for having a debt crisis in the future.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fayol. I am going to give Michaela the floor after you've all commented. So I think these are valid questions that are being put to you. So, Koen, I made a very, very quick introduction to our panelists, and I'm assuming that everyone here knows everyone because we are working on the same topics for so long. But Koen was, of course, the first EU ambassador to the African Union. And, Stefano made a point that I think is very important, which is that it's not just about Europe in Africa anymore, and Africa is part of a chessboard, geopolitical chessboard. And sometimes I think in this city and maybe other capitals, we tend to think that we are still the priority partner, and maybe we are not, and we shouldn't be, perhaps, because there's expertise elsewhere as well. So I was wondering, having watched the continent grow, change, transform, having watched our relationship with Africa change, transform, where do you think the next leap forward should come from? And do you think that these 4 areas that have been pinpointed are the key ones to work on? Yeah, you have yours.
I have one. Thank you very much. Good question. I really believe we are still the prime partner, and I think the figures you mentioned on trade, on development assistance, on investment, we are still your biggest partner on the continent, and we are certainly determined to continue and being this. But it's not a given, and you also said, Harriet, no business as usual. And I think that's good. And a bit of competition for the European Union is always good. It keeps you on your toes. And I think we learned, and that's why we have been, over the last couple of years, to a great extent, resetting our agenda together with Africa. We have abandoned saying we work in Africa, we work with Africa. And at the last summit of the European Union with the African Union in Abidjan, to a certain extent, we have reset the agenda. And all the elements we are discussing here have been introduced then. In particular, the focus on economic development, the focus on investment, the focus on job creation, because that's what our African partners have asked us to do. And that's linked, of course, also to skill development and the global health issues and so on. So this is now firmly on the agenda, and I believe that the 4 areas presented by the Center fit very well into it. But it's also, I agree, a critical moment because we have to deliver on this. And it's not only a new commission that is coming, we are also discussing our new financial cycle framework. So for the first time, we are resetting our policies and we can link it with a new financial cycle. So we have to ensure that the new policies are implemented in the future. Of course, the 4 areas identified, and you mentioned it, there are only 4. Ursula von der Leyen, the President-elect, when she made her first speech, she said we need a comprehensive agenda for Africa. Africa was one of the 2 geographical areas she mentioned in her speech, the Balkans and Africa, so it shows already the importance she will attach to it. And I think it is important to keep this comprehensive approach. Of course, we have to identify specific areas, and I will comment on them, but it needs to fit in a global approach, and I will come back to that. On migration and labor migration, legal pathways, as Stefano said, I think this has been the weakest link in our approach towards migration. We have a full, what we call the Valletta agenda, working on the root causes, combating trafficking, working on return and readmission, and also legal pathways, and it is one we haven't developed. And I think it's rather smart to see how we can link labor and skills development with migration. And in that sense, I think it is a positive proposal, and we can develop it further. It is important also because we should not see it only from Europe-Africa perspective, but also Africa internal. 70% of migration is African. You have your free movement regulation now, decision, which is critical for integration. We see what is happening in South Africa these days, the tensions. We all are confronted with the same problems, challenges, and I think together we can help overcoming them. On the external investment, yes, and I will not dwell on the mechanism. What I would like to say here, and for all these areas, you need to work together. It's not just us de-risking, promoting, it's also our African partners creating the right business environment, the right investment environment. And that is critically important, and we do quite some work with the European economic development on this. And which is linked also to trade. I still sense a bit of a negative perception on the economic partnership agreements, which I think are not justified. But it is at the continental free trade area which is now the game changer. And I think the rather clear and very clear policy decision also by President Juncker to say our economic partnership agreements are now at the service and a building block for the continental free trade area is, I think, something that really changes the terms of discussion on the EPAs and how we can make them. But I agree also that Europe is the most integrated internal market, and I think this is something we should benefit. Should be able of benefiting of all the expertise we have of creating an internal market, because in the end, if you want to invest, you will have to create also an internal market. That's the incentive. So these are some areas. So comprehensive. We don't talk about security, we don't talk about instability, the overall governance remains important, and then a reciprocal commitment. Policy decisions on both sides and commitment to implement on both sides. And then I think we will be able to move forward very much.
Okay. So I had said initially I like the fact that we're not covering everything, and you're basically saying we still need to cover everything. I just wonder, Don Michele, I would say, isn't it true that we should perhaps divide the responsibility of working, because some people are good in some things and some people are good at other things, and the Africans also have a choice to make. So perhaps your response to some of the comments that have been made, please.
Thank you very much, and all very, very useful comments. So let me just take this last point, the 4 proposals that we have put forward. I mean, what we tried to do was explore within the center our areas of expertise, the research that we've been doing, and actually try and bring to the table what we thought could be some very concrete, actionable proposals. We are not the world's leading experts in climate change, unfortunately, although we hope to become that at some point. Although we do have a program on the future of work and artificial intelligence, which we are just getting off the ground now. Again, we didn't feel we were in a strong enough position to be able to put forward some concrete recommendations without merely just restating the challenges of which we are all very familiar. Maybe if I can respond to some of the points, Stefano, the importance of an alliance with economic actors and civil society. It's absolutely crucial for us, and this is going to be a big part of our migration work moving forward as well. We have already seen that the Global Skills Partnership proposal that we are putting forward is gaining traction. And I have a colleague here who's leading the program itself. But for example, Belgium will be working with Guinea on a new global skills partnership. So things are moving. I think the importance of taking the idea as well to Africa and developing intra-Africa partnerships is also going to be crucial. The problem is, as the ambassador has said, this is, in terms of the relationship between Europe and Africa, it is not a level playing field at the moment. You do not have 2 equal partners sitting at the table. And so in order to get there, there is going to be a huge amount of upskilling that will need to happen in Africa, which is a requisite to, as you said, to accruing the benefits of integration. Debt levels, yes. I mean, we're aware and have been monitoring the rising debt levels in certain African countries. Of course, climate change is a very important issue. I've mentioned why. At this point, we haven't covered it. What I want to say, though, is that this, once again, this is not a strategy. We do not see this as a mirror strategy for the EU-Africa partnership. We are trying to take what we think is a rhetoric that is certainly moving in the right direction on the European side, and see whether we can take it that step forward to actually make it a reality.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panel. Sorry, speaking to the wrong end of the microphone. Thank you very much to the panel for all your comments. Now, I'd like to, as I said earlier, lots of expertise and knowledge within this room. So I'd like to turn the floor to you, your comments. We have half an hour. So if you could keep your comments short and to the point, and perhaps also questions, please name the panelists that you want to ask the question to. So yes, please, sir. We have a roving microphone, and please, sir, go ahead. Introduce yourself also very, very quickly, please. Can I see a show of hands of other people who'd like to come in? Yes. David, One Campaign. Anyone else coming in? Please don't be shy. This is the moment to ask questions, and I really want this interactive discussion. Please, sir.
Thank you, Shada. I'm Mr. Baruti. I'm involved in cooperation for development for, let's say, 20 years. I'm based in Belgium, and as African, I want to give some input on the presentation of my Madame Michaela, which I greet because we know each other since a long time. The first one is for Africa Free Trade Area. I want to clarify that it depends on the way Africa leaders themselves they will behave vis-à-vis their own population. Because if I give the example of the Ebola outbreak in DRC, I'm from DRC, when the outbreak raised, Uganda and Rwanda closed the border. In Africa perception, when your neighbor is in the problem and you close your doors, it means that you are not yet ready to cooperate. That is one aspect. The second is relating to the involvement of civil society, as Mr. Stefan raised. I would add that not only civil society, but also community. In DRC, in certain part of country, the number of deaths from Ebola outbreak raised because of misperception between community, push some medical staff not to care the population affected by Ebola, but they don't say it clearly. It took a long time to discover that it was this kind of misperception between community because they were suspecting the community affected that they are hosting rebellion people. So it's better to involve not only civil society but also a community living in the border. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Sophia, South Africa, please introduce yourself very quickly.
Thank you very much. I'm Sophia from the South African Mission.
You need a microphone.
I have a very voice.
No, that's fine. I think we are being web streamed and recorded and all kinds of things, so you do need a microphone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm Suhaifa Subedar from the South African Embassy, and thank you for the invitation to this very important event. Thank you, Michaela. I was really pleased to see that you have brought back the issue of the Common Agricultural Policy with regard to subsidies, because at the heart of all issues is poverty. And even as Mr. Kunferfaka mentioned, the issues taking place in South Africa at the moment, it's about resources. The migration policies in Europe affect countries in Africa directly. And what we see are the results of all of this. So we need a very honest, frank conversation to find true win-win solutions, not just issues of migration in terms of securitization, but issues of migration in terms of development. What do they mean? How do we deal with these issues in terms of finding solutions that can actually work for all of us? Just to mention that with regard to the alliance of President Juncker, we all eventually welcomed it, although there was not really a consultation process. We see now that with the incoming president, there is a possibility of a Green New Deal, and we hope we can do things differently, where we can all sit around the table. Brussels is full of buildings with lots of spaces. All ambassadors here have plenipotentiary powers. We would like a full interrogation to discuss this, that it is not just made in Brussels and given to us in Africa. But thank you very much. We welcome the interest of Europe in Africa.
Thank you very much. I'll go to David and then to you. Just David from the One Campaign.
Thanks, Shara. You mentioned at the start that we've been working together on a high-level group on the Europe-Africa relationship that brings together former heads of government and multilaterals and business leaders and so on. And one of the interesting themes that has come out of that is the need for a shift in perception. I think among some quarters there is a perception that Africa needs Europe for development cooperation and many other things. But I think, over the coming decades, the shift will happen where Europe will need Africa for human capital, for people with skills, for the innovation and ideas that come with youth, as Europe gets older and Africa has a booming youth population. So I think we need to contribute to that shift, as well as having these very concrete ideas that kind of demonstrate that we're serious. The second point is about global norms. We all know what's happening in China with a very different kind of approach to democracy and development. We know what's happening in the US. It seems that Africa and Europe share a very common vision about how governance should take place, and I think there's a global role that those two continents can play together. And then the third point is just on resources. Michaela mentioned that there isn't in reality an equal playing field, and there are massive needs for investment in human capital. So as part of the MFF process, we have been arguing that there should be an investment of 140 billion euros, particularly in things like health and education that will enable people to fulfill their potential and create businesses and jobs and make this all come to life. So I think we need to make those investments now rather than later, because that's the way that it will pay off.
Thank you. Please. The gentleman there.
Thank you. My name is Andreas Backhaus from SEPS. I have a question regarding the topic of skills and upskilling that you mentioned. So by upskilling and training people, for example, for European labor markets, you would start at the end of their educational career after they went through the schooling system in their countries of origin. And we would need to do that because we know that while education has expanded, learning has actually not. That the educational system is still very ineffective in providing people with skills for the labor market. Why do we talk about then upskilling of young adults instead of helping with the reform of the educational system in order to make it more effective in the production of skills for everyone there? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please. Let me take quite a few comments and then we'll come back to you. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Matoya Wolf. I'm the representative of the Spanish Agency for Development Cooperation here in Brussels. Thank you so much for organizing that and for moderating that. And I would have a question both for Michaela, also for Koen, and for the ambassador. On the EIP and your quite sharp criticism to it, first of all, just a comment on the EIP. It has just been launched so somehow, so we cannot write the results already. But you mentioned the climate investment, many in the forum. So what would be your three main recommendations on climate investment in different African countries? What would you recommend as the needed reforms for climate investment in order to foster real impact investment and also very much related to SDGs and Agenda 2030? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Did I see? Yes, I did. Yes. So please, there's another hand up there.
Marek Dąbrowski, Bruegel. The two things which I consider as very big obstacles to African development are continuing conflict and governance problem. They were not discussed in this report, but is anything here which Europe can do more than it did in the past to remove these obstacles, especially conflict resolutions?
Thank you. Yes, the lady over here, please.
Thank you for a great panel. My name is Ama Panin from the World Bank. And as a Ghanaian, I usually find myself reminding people that Africa is a continent and not a country. But I feel like my question this time for the panel is turning that around, which is thinking about the diversity of Europe and European countries with different interests, different histories, and engagement with the continent. I'd be curious to hear some of your reflections on how the different interests might hinder the sort of coordinated actions that you've been speaking of, and how we should think about that as we think of a European connection with Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please. Yes.
Yes, we have been speaking about partnership among equals. We have been talking about the need to have a more political dialogue on these global challenges, and that the EU-Africa partnership is meant to really help facing these challenges. I would like to know how now you are doing a political dialogue with Africans, with the African Union, with the African bodies, political bodies, on the post-Cotonou agreement, because this is a key issue on the table now. And I've heard that it is rather blocked for the time being, because on one hand there is a mandate to negotiate with in an SCP framework, but considering that Africa is not united or integrated, still catching out the North African issues and so on. And the other one, there is the request of the African Union politically, which have been already raised in 2006 in the Lisbon first EU-Africa summit, that now Europe should consider Africa as a continent, as united, and therefore a new framework for cooperation and partnership should be developed. And therefore this is why African Union has been asking for a continent-to-continent framework. So I would like to know more about this issue, please.
Great
How
question.
we deal with that.
Yeah, fine. And the gentleman just next to you, so...
Thank you. Well, mine is more of a comment, and that's this question of Europe-Africa. Of course, I'm ambassador to Europe, and therefore I should, as an ambassador to Europe, I should emphasize that that's the most important relationship. At least the ambassador to China will say Europe is most important.
The ambassador I'm sorry, I don't know you yet, so Ambassador Namibia, that's what I thought, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes,
Mr. Mubende.
I thought you did.
Yes, I do. Mr. Mubende.
Which you do. Yes. But I was surprised, was David was talking about that Africa needs Europe now and Europe will need Africa in the future. Europe has always needed Africa.
Good point.
You know, and it goes back. They needed slaves, and they needed raw materials, and it goes on. So let's get away from the perception that one needs the other more than the other. And that's why it's a partnership. And there is also complementarity in terms of economies, in terms of, I think that's, I just wanted to dispel that notion that Europe would need Africa in the future. Europe has always needed Africa. Maybe they needed Africa more than Africa needed Europe. And that's a historical fact. And I just for the record. I think the second point is, now I've been distracted. Now, then the other issue is, yes, the question of whether the partnership is not equal. And we don't meet as equal. I think I had that. Well, we take ourselves seriously. And when we meet there, when I meet with Stefano, we are equal. I don't feel that I'm inferior to him in any way. He may have more money than I do, but that's besides the point. You know, and I think we believe in the sovereign equality of nation states. And when we meet there with our little resources, with all our challenges, we go there as equals. And we talk as equals. And so, therefore, we have to dispel some of these notions. I think there is a serious partnership that has been taking place and at different levels. I think that's one. Now, in terms of the future Africa-Europe, that's a complex one. But Africa, I think as far as Africa is concerned, they have taken a decision. African heads of state have decided how they want to engage Europe going forward. So there's no doubt about that. And we're very clear how we want to engage Europe going forward. There are two tracks, which is the ACP and the Africa-EU joint partnership. And the relationship between those two, when you come to concrete implementation of programs and projects and even political dialogue, I think it's quite clear that yes, and even there's a compromise where you have a specific African protocol under the Cotonou that will facilitate a meeting between Europe and Africa under that framework. So there is no clarity. I mean, there is no lack of clarity. What we all need to do is to complete the negotiations on specific issues and agree and move forward. And thank you, and sorry for being a bit long.
No, that's fine, Ambassador. I'm just very conscious of the time because we need to finish by 6 o'clock, but I do want to take the comment from the lady at the back, and then that will be the end of... you want to come in as well? Okay, then one more comment, please.
My name is Amanda Bisong from ECDPM, and my question is directed basically to the panelists from the European Commission. European Union Commission. I'm looking now and listening also to the discussions about this equal partnership between Europe and Africa. And while we've seen it also in the discussions between Europe and African partners being restated severally, we also see a different level of these partnerships occurring at the bilateral, at the regional, and at the continental level. And sometimes we see that one level is being used to undermine the partnerships at another level. So I'm trying to understand here if there's some level of policy coherence that is at work or isn't at work, or is willingly being ignored by some states. And also, while there's a lot of dialogue and discussion on equal partnership, why the quality of this partnership is being, or we're seeing that it's being diminished at some points when it comes to relationships at the bilateral level.
Okay, thank you. And last point by Gwilym, EBRD.
Thank you very much. Gwilym Jones from the EBRD. Well, thank you very much for this paper, which is very interesting and stimulating. First question to the Ambassador. We heard Koen Verwerke talk about the EPAs being a building block for the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Very interested to hear your views also on how the existing regional integration processes already there in Africa fit in, and how these are being fitted together, ECOWAS, CEMAC, CEAC, and so on. And then, of course, like my Spanish colleague, I can't but react also to the rather early criticism of the EFSD, and say that, you know, like my colleague, it's very early days to come in. The proposals are just on the table, so I felt that was rather harsh. But still, I hear what you say about wanting much bigger focus on fragile economies, and I'd be interested to hear from the panel, A, how it sees this, but also perhaps to reflect more broadly, because of course, you know, we're talking about the Continental Free Trade Agreement, we're talking about regional integration. So part of the underlying philosophy is surely also that we want emerging economies to be there to drive the growth and the attractiveness also of the fragile economies. So, you know, I always felt that the fact of keeping it open in the regulation between fragile economies and a broader focus was also because we want that balance between doing things in fragile areas, but also using the growth of the bigger emerging economies to help those in more fragile circumstances. And I'd be interested in the reflections of the panel on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gwilym. Thank you, everyone, for your comments and questions. I'm going to go back to the panel. Start with you, Ambassador, if I may, to give your reactions. Please, panelists, don't jump on every single issue that's been raised. Just choose what you think is the most relevant for you. So, Ambassador, quite a few that are relevant for you.
Thank you, Shada. That's comforting. So, the EPAs. For West Africa, we've had to sign the interim EPA because two of the countries in West Africa, the cocoa-producing countries, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, we needed to sign this because all our cocoa was coming to Europe. And being our largest trading partner, we needed to safeguard that commodity. Now, if you take SADC, the EPAS was, I can say, fully operational. In Central Africa, it was just one country, I think, and it didn't happen elsewhere on the continent. But the EPAS gave us it gave us a framework. It also gave us the ability to pull together the resources that we could all enjoy when we integrate our economies. Let's also take our regional trading blocks, like you said. The formation of ECOWAS, the formation of COMESAC, SADC, all the different economic areas, is what we have used to pull ourselves together. Right now, we have all realized how important it is to maximize all the advantages that each and every regional area would have. If you go down south, and those in the oceans, they talk about the blue economy, which is very important. If you come to West Africa, we have the commodities, we have the black gold. If you go elsewhere, the water resources. So we have realized that on the continent we have all these, and through the regional economic communities, we are able to pull together our resources. And the heads of state, they have realized this and are talking together. The Inga Dam, the Africa we want to see in 2030, has brought together, we have open skies now, we have visa-free agreements being signed here and there. So you will realize that within the trading blocks and within our economic communities, it has helped us to fashion out how we can pool our resources together and work together towards this integration that we are all seeing. Thank you for raising that. My question, Gwen, the EPAs. And I also wanted to ask a question on the EPAs. Do we come with the coming in of the CFTA? Do we do away with the EPAs? No. Or do we mainstream the EPAs to be able to infuse it into, if I should use that word, into the what we want to see in the CFTA? And talking about Africa needing Europe or Europe needing Africa, let's take by 2050, the largest workforce is going to be on the African continent. The youth are going to be the largest workforce in the whole world, and Africa has those numbers now. What do we do now? Train them so that when you need them, you'll be able to fall on them. Should we not be talking about the skills building, the skills transfer? These are things that I am hoping that we will be looking at. And hence my rehashing AI. I don't know, but I have this phobia about the AI and how it's going to, the skills training, how the job creation, how it's going to influence all that. These are my thoughts on the issues raised. Thank you, Shada.
Thank you, Ambassador. And absolutely on AI, I think we're all going to be working on AI in Africa in the coming weeks and months, so that's clear. So, Koen, I was going to give you the floor, but the ambassadors asked the question, so kick off.
Thank you. I will want to respond to 2 or 3 questions. First of all, the diversity within the European Union. I think there was a question on that side of the room. Of course, we have countries we have a specific past or a specific focus on Africa, but I think, and that's exactly also the work the External Action Service will do, and the High Representative, the new High Representative will continue, is to forge an Africa policy. And none of our member states is able to take on the different challenges that are faced in Africa. So there's a strong wish to come together. And to have EU policy, not only in the development side, and I think that works well also in joint programming, but certainly also in politics. What we do in the Sahel with the G5 Sahel, of course we have Germany, we have France, we're taking lead roles, but together with many other member states, we have 16 member states actually working in Mali in the area of security. as a member of the UN mission, as a member of our European Union missions, or bilaterally. So it shows that from Finland to Italy, all member states are now really focused on Africa. And that brings me to the point of do we need Africa? And of course, I think the ambassador of Namibia is right. We have needed Africa in the past for many reasons, and not always certainly positive or good reasons. And I think this has changed now. I think what is changed is that we have a convergence of interests. Europe really has a need that Africa is stable and prosperous, for demographic reasons, for security reasons, and on top of it we need Africa also, and it has been said, for the global agenda. Together we can determine a global agenda, and it's very difficult to find partners these days in the world to set a positive agenda, and I think we can do this together. So it's this convergence of interests which changes, and I think that makes also the equality of the partnership. That goes beyond, as has been said, beyond the financial means. On EPAs, I think it's the way you said it at the second option. It should infuse the continental free trade area. I think it's important to continue. Your country is a partner and benefits from it. Of course, there are always problems, but a continental free trade area will have to be built on the experience of a regional market, and I think that's what EPAs exactly are trying to do.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fayol.
I just would like to make 2 or 3 comments. One, I think one of the big changes why the EU-Africa partnership is more equal than before is because many of the challenges are actually more and more not the same, but not that different between Europe and Africa. When you look at climate, when you look at health, when you look at the number of these big challenges, they are not so different. And the solutions are not so different, actually. And we use our experience to in different geographies to help other geographies, and this cross-fertilization is quite helpful. My second comment is to stress one point that Kun made in his first intervention. EIP uses what we have tried to develop with the Juncker plan for investment within Europe, which is not only financing, but technical assistance and thinking in terms of policy reforms. And the 3 go together. And if we want to strengthen the investment possibilities in Africa, and we are a bank, we are not going to develop projects that are not bankable. If you want to develop bankable projects, you need these other 2 beyond financing, that is more technical assistance and more of the policy agenda. And one final word on governance. For us at EIB, what we have seen in the recent period is a need looking forward to include more in the way we manage the governance of projects, more the views of the beneficiary countries from Africa.
Thank you. Stefano?
Well, thank you. Obviously, time is short. I used to take this kind of discussion not just to, present the position that everybody knows, but rather to participate to what is a genuine search. Because my first point is that, if we want to take seriously all what we are saying, the alliance, or in the case the partnership among equal, etc., we are progressively to get rid of a certain number of language, concept, and a bit of hypocrisy, which is on all sides, if we want to look at the reality in face. you know. This is what my friend Ambassador of Namibia is saying. We are equal. When we sit, we are equal. And therefore, I'm entitled to blame on it when it does things which are wrong, and we should do increasingly, because it is not just hiding behind the development assistance and then a sort of way that everything is, etc., etc. Undermining. Africans are undermining themselves every day at all levels. Look at what Nigeria is doing in Western Africa. Let's get rid of all this. Let's look at facts in order to be able to work really as equal, because we are in this dimension. It's a huge work, and I have to say, in particular for those which have been working embedded in the development in the old fashion, in which many things have been set aside. Now, we cannot do it. And we cannot do it precisely for the reasons that I tried to put at the beginning. We are talking about the shaping of a new world. Not just about the relationship between two continents. If we do it wrong, the contribution that our partnership is giving to a search of a new equilibrium, balance, etc., in this multipolar world will fail. And on this, SDGs are important, not as indicators of transfer of money, but as indicators of pushing ahead right policies of sustainability. This is what I want to say. And please think in these terms, because then we can enter really into a discussion which is much more, let's say, operational and useful. I come back to a certain number of points, in particular EIP. I think that contrary to what maybe I was supposed to say, and maybe said, I think that the call on the missing, let's say, clear political steer, a bit exaggerated maybe, but the call to focus better on what we want and how is the right one. Because it is true that, this investment plan has been launched first, starting on migration. Create jobs in order to stop. We know that is much more than this. Second, blending and de-risking. Yes, but blending and de-risk is not something that is invented in 2 days. If we are not able progressively to identify where this can add value in the vast world of what the international financial institution, World Bank and others are doing, then we're simply missing what is the new added value on this, which cannot be everywhere on everything. So, third, it is also true that missing this, it is obvious that the balance is seen elsewhere or in another way, which is, and I can testify because otherwise we are joking ourselves, that very often we conclude with our partners, being EIB or others, more on the basis of reconstructing ex post what we have to do, but not building the pipeline as we should. And by the way, when we are saying now in this pre-programming phase, is precisely to call on our delegation and their still limited expertise. We call on the EIB as EU bank to work much more together in order, and we call on the member state each visit I have and say, look, next pipeline should come from you, not from the EIB, IFD, KfW, etc., etc. Because today is a bit like this, and the fact that each of these institutions are in any case producing something which is linked to the country is not enough. Don't want to say it's bad, simply say it's not enough. If we want to really say, and be serious in saying that investment under guarantee is another mean in order to reach SDG, we have to fill this gap. Therefore, the call is welcome. Could be a bit exaggerated, a bit, but it's welcome, because this must be decided. Third point, one of the things that, in my view, is starting appearing in our experience is a bit what Ambroise said, in the sense that we have to intervene more on the financial market in the countries. The banking system in the average African country cannot sustain any kind of investment generated from inside. Certainly not finance small and medium enterprise, certainly not finance startup, but this cannot be done by external. We are setting up an expertise in guarantee fund. But then we have to work with the countries in order to professionalize the financial market service. Because this is not. Assuming that a bank wants in Burkina Faso wants accept even the idea to finance a startup, they have not the capacity to analyze the business plan on average. Therefore, the fact to intervene on the capital market and financial services in the countries, in our now, let's say, experience, is something that starting indicated an area in which our added value could be good. Then, on the trade chapter, and is also in the light, I think, frankly, that the trade chapter is probably the weakest one, because it is still tainted with a certain number of assumptions which are not entirely correct. First, agriculture, use subsidies, frankly speaking, it's empty. There is virtually no agriculture subsidy in our export, okay? By the way, the international market is not on tariff. It's about standard. It's about quality. Here there are barriers, of course. Here there are barriers. And precisely in the moment when there is a discussion and the process on the setting up of the continental free trade area, we are all well advised, if we want to increase the possibility for investment intra-Africa and from Europe to Africa, to look about the standards. Because otherwise, the tariff not exist, agricultural subsidy, come on, they're virtually close to zero. But the barriers are not on this, are on the quality, are on the phytosanitary, are on this. And we believe that our experience in having built our single market could be a good, let's say, story to tell to our African friends, which at the end will decide what they want. But if we are economically so integrated, and not exclusively, I think that we have to concentrate on this. Rules of origin, yes, are important, but marginally, unless we want to turn African manufacturers still unfinished effort into a sewing machine, as we knew in Cambodia and in others, which have created very low-skilled labor market. I don't think that this is what we need to do in Africa. At least should not be our ambition in the sense. This is what I think we have to look at. And to compare notes on that, and the relationship between post-Cotonou ACP on one side, the African Union on the other side, apart from the fact that negotiations are going on very well, to a point that on the 28th of September there will be one of the final provisional negotiation session between the two chief negotiations in order to precisely starting fixing what is the design. But one thing must be true, because otherwise we don't understand each other. The new post-Cotonou DCP cannot be seen as the development/cash machine of a political alliance. If we separate the two, we are dead. Instead of reinforcing what we are doing, we will even make weaker. Reason why we have insisted since the beginning that the African pillar of the post-Cotonou should accommodate, in a way or another, the rich political debate experience that we have done in the joint strategy and with the African Union. African Union Commission, we said several times, made a huge mistake in opposing this, huge mistake politically, because it was based on the presumption that they could have become the federator and negotiator for the whole of Africa without having the experience and without having a mandate, But we knew this, but instead of saying, don't do it, we tried to accommodate this because we have to be pragmatic. We wanted to have and expand this, but we don't want to have a dissociation with all the rest and with the key stakeholders of the African Union, which are African member states. So just to say that we have to work on this, then the different level, the regional, the IPA and the continental. Obviously the IPAs are, or in any case, not our IPA, your regional integration are the starting building blocks of the continental, because if you dismantle, this would be totally logic, starting from SACU and SADC, but also arriving elsewhere. But at the same time, progressively, and I think, by the way, in the plan of the African Union negotiator is precisely to first, let's say, create the bridges between the blocks and the continent and progressively harmonizing. This, I think, is, so therefore, from this point of view, I think that we have to make an effort in order to share even more what we have to do. For the rest, I think many think that I fully agree, but I also welcome, sometimes the critical spirit. Maybe it could not be fully, to the center, but in this moment, it's better to maybe, to leverage a bit with the criticism rather than to say, everything's okay. You just, many things are okay. Many things will require a push.
Right.
And therefore, I think it's okay. Thank you.
Absolutely, Stefano. Thank you very much indeed. So, Michela, You've heard the comments, you've got some good advice, some constructive comments, and some criticism as well. So very quickly, because we're already over time, do you want to say something in response? What's the next step for your roadmap? What are you going to do? And then I want to wind up.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists and the audience as well for some very useful comments. This is just the beginning as far as we're concerned. So our intention now with the roadmap is to take each area, each chapter separately, and to try and dig deeper and to see whether we can sit down with the Commission, with other colleagues, with our African partners, to try and see whether we can make any inroads and steps forward. So over the next few months, at least, we will be publishing more research behind each of the chapters. We will be producing blogs as well and continuing the conversations in smaller, more focused fora as well. As we have in fact been doing with our work on the external investment plan as well. And if I could just add one thing, I mean, we are essentially very positive about the external investment plan. When it was launched in 2017, not that recently, but the Commission was proposing to take a relatively small amount of money and use that to create risk-sharing tools to bring the development finance institutions together to collaborate a lot more in proposing projects. And I accept that only a few of these contracts have only been recently signed. But I think what the big concern is for us now is that it was fine when, as it was first launched, for the Commission to let 1,000 flowers bloom. Because it was one of our Dutch colleagues who said, actually, this was like flying a plane whilst building it. And that's perfectly acceptable. But as the new Commission comes into office and the new multi-annual framework is finally agreed, which is proposing a massive scale-up in the use of these risk-sharing tools, there are certain preconditions that need to be met before that actually happens. And that is, it needs to be much more focused with a lot more money at your disposal. It's got to be focused on the initial intention, which was to mobilize investment where the need is greatest.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much indeed. We've overstepped our time limit, so I really need to bring this to an end. But Michaela, your point is well taken. Just to wrap up, I think one thing that Michaela said I think is very, very important is we're all working on these issues, all of you here as well, I'm sure, conditional on our areas of expertise. And I think that is something that is very important. And it's something that Stefano has also said. It's the importance of networking, working together, coordinating. We can't all in Africa and in Europe do the same thing, and we shouldn't, but we can divide our responsibilities. And important, crucial to work with Africans, and that means with African think tanks as well, Ambassador, just a note for you. Final point, I've been a journalist working for the BBC African Service. Koen knows that, Sefa knows that. And it's been an incredible voyage when it comes to Africa. I am so delighted now that this is not just a marginal issue that a few journalists and a few policy experts do when they're covering the global story. We are really deep inside the geopolitical issue, and we're deep inside trying to renovate, re-energize this question. My only point now would be with the One Campaign and Mo Ibrahim Foundation, we're really focusing also on women. Girls and women, education, skilling, upscaling skills for women and girls, because, Ambassador, you can appreciate that for us, that is, I think, really the way to the future of Africa. No women, no development. So thank you very much indeed, Michaela, for asking me to moderate. Thank you to the panelists, and I think we have a reception now, so we're ready to go. Thank you.